Good afternoon and welcome to the April meeting of the Board of Early Education Care here in Massachusetts. Thanks to all of you who have joined us. I think it is a little officially spring since we last met, and we've had some of that weather too. So great to see you all. I hope things are looking up for many of you in your communities. I know the vaccination rates are certainly cause for optimism while we continue to manage through the pandemic. I think on that note, I won't take up too much time. I want to cede the floor to the commissioner, who has a lot of fantastic content for today. But I think from my perspective as board chair, and certainly as we look back and it's been a full year plus through the pandemic, I think today's agenda kind of reflects my strong, positive and meaningful affirmation of both the commitment to the systems building work and to making real and meaningful progress in those domains while remaining totally vigilant and focused on support for the field over the next few months. I mean, I think the danger and downside, obviously big picture, amazing to have the vaccination rates where they are, but COVID is still very, very much here in Massachusetts, and lots of the data suggests we just have to maintain real vigilance. So appreciate that the commissioner and her team continue to hold this kind of full lens, so we continue to build the system back better, if you will, and maintain real support for the field to continue with public health practices right through the summer. So just want to sort of say from my perspective, love to turn it over to the commissioner for her comments, but I see this commitment to the dual approach, and it's fantastic. Commissioner.
Thank you so much. It has been a remarkable time in working with my colleagues across the country in a similar position of knowing that we have the grave urgency of getting supports out to make sure that we don't lose traction on any of the progress we've made over the last decades as a field, but also the great opportunity to really try to think about what systems need to be put in place to make sure that we come back stronger and quite frankly prepared to deal with the unknown, because we don't know exactly what parents are going to need, what families are going to need, or what communities are really going to need as we move forward. So thank you for that endorsement. I am going to take the commissioner's prerogative today, and in addition to the materials that I know are posted online and you all have in front of you to talk through today, I want to give some updates on some things that are not necessarily substantive enough to warrant agenda items, but also I know our progress on things that we've been talking about in an ongoing way, and want to make sure that we are updating both you and the field throughout the progress. So first of all, talking about the summer programming, we are working with the Executive Office of Education and DESE in particular to look at launching a partnership this week that will amplify the coordination and the duration of services offered through the summer for in-person learning, specifically targeted to children who have had very limited in-person school experiences heading into next year. So knowing that there are some cases where there may be kids going into third grade who've had less than 6 months of in-person education if they didn't go to kindergarten. And so there are many different varieties of family choices over the last couple of years that would put children in having very limited experiences. And we know that for young children entering school, that relationship with the teacher, familiarity with the location, and for families who maybe not have had as much experience with the school district to date, that these may be really critical summer weeks to try to capture some of those really important collaborations. So we're working to be able to support districts, and hopefully we'll be able to reach 50 communities, up to 50 communities if we have more interest. Excited to be able to provide more of that. and working really with some national partners and community partners and the United Way to think about ensuring really high quality summer programming that that brings in all the partners that are available to support in-service delivery for families over the summer. So more information coming about that, but really I want to highlight that we know communities are deep into planning for summer, and that this is really designed as an opportunity to enhance or expand or deepen that opportunity, not necessarily to replace or replicate that, but really to think about if we could do more, if you had more resources, more national models to be able to leverage, that we would be able to reach more children, that we'd be able to provide more data that could target and make sure the outreach to those children who may be truly most at risk of not having had substantive school experiences are really part of the thinking headed in what we're looking at as heading back into in-person now for a school district, and what we hope will be some sense of normalcy headed into the fall. So updating on that, for those of you who will continue to keep updated on the details of that, and really making sure that as the opportunity solidifies and we have some written announcements of that, keep in look in our field email that goes out regularly on our website, and obviously we'll continue to let our partners know so that we can make sure the message is getting out there. In addition, I wanted to give some quick updates on some upcoming and I know very urgently awaited policies. We have alerted the field that these policies are coming, so hopefully there is some planning underway, but wanted to make sure that we were highlighting those as we finalize our minimum requirements, revising our minimum requirements for childcare programs, and also our playbook, which offers some guidance around revised best practices now that we have some more emerging research, have vaccinations underway, and have in-person learning from DESE school districts continuing to get started up for the rest of the year. We are revising our minimum requirements in our playbook. We will be enhancing those that guidance around what the research continues to show keeps group settings safe around increased ventilation, masks, and social distancing, cleaning and sanitation and hand washing, and starting to allow for more in-person services and incorporating more, again, normalcy into our day-to-day. Really making sure that our providers who are open and operating, and our CFCEs, our other mental health consultants, those who may be delivering those in-person services, still understand that that we need to abide by all of the health and safety protocols, the health attestations, and really make sure that we are doubling down on those practices that we know can keep us safe while we allow for some of those services that we know are critical during this time. And so just that will include aligning with DESE's distancing requirements and masking requirements from the governor's order, as well as our transportation policies have been revised to allow for more flexibility. But I do want to emphasize that while our childcare providers are doing an amazing job of really keeping these practices in place, it's not only on them to do this. And what we're seeing when we see exposures and we see positive tests in our childcare now, it's about things happening outside of childcare where people are letting down their guard, or getting together in group settings, and then coming into this environment that is that really is trying its best to keep children, families, and staff and workforce safe. And so I just want to keep reiterating to our field and assure the board that we are continuing to provide materials to providers to help them also remind families and staff that it's not only what you do in the center, but what you do, or in the home, but what you do outside of the childcare facility that really is going wanting to make sure that our centers, our facilities, our homes continue to be safe places for children. And so we're working on materials and reminders and things that can make sure that as we head into the summer, we can continue to provide those critical services and remind people that the practices are all of our responsibility to make sure we're maintaining as we head into back to in-person. Finally, on that note, I wanted to update one other policy that I know the board has asked about in a couple different iterations, and making sure that people know that we are still looking to maintain the flexibility in our subsidies, in our subsidy policy, including providing options where providers can continue to be reimbursed for full day care as children may need that, despite their attendance in full day at the moment as schools go back. We've been watching our providers for a year and understanding the difficult choices that have to be made when there is an exposure or positive test that may require some quick decisions and impact families. And we want to make sure that the option that our childcare providers through the rest of the school year are options for our families if they do need full day care and aren't needing to quarantine, that is something that they have access to. And so we're continuing to provide the flexibility. That's coming out in writing shortly, but I know that as schools have gone back to in person, this question has come up, and I wanted to assure the board that we were continuing in the vein of being able to provide that flexibility for our providers through the fiscal year. Finally, a couple more things. Sorry, I know this will be a little bit of I wanted to provide a little bit of an update on the parent fee as promised at the last board meeting, that we would provide a little bit more information on the feedback we got from the parent fees. And I just wanted to just remind, we had over 150 participants in our sessions on feedback that really, they were to solicit feedback on the parent fee model, but also guiding operational implementation on that. And so, and we had about 20 active public comment responses as well. Reminder, just what we did with the parent fee is that we have exempted any income under 100% federal poverty level. So that has prevented the cliff at the beginning onset of a fee of going from zero fee to having your whole income, the fee applied to your whole income. The 6 additional comments were submitted to EEC as well, and all really were very positive. I think we have gotten such resounding endorsement of pioneering approach that is really so supportive to families, and I have gotten some interest from other states that are looking to really think about how they could apply something like this to their subsidy co-pays as well. The comments really largely focused on implementation, which we continue to grapple with and plan for, with most of them really being targeted towards the termination process and what we might use to terminate, what policies we might have around termination around co-pays. Now, we do hope that by making the fees more affordable, that this will become less of a pressing issue in our field as well. But there is a tension in this area with providers who are asking to keep this requirement to allow for suspensions and allow for an option to terminate so that they can hold parents accountable to the required copay that we ourselves are required to charge as part of our federal requirements, but also others and parent-facing entities asking for flexibility and options with, repayment agreements and other ways to address non-payment. So this is something that we continue to grapple with and really understand over the course of our implementation and our look at our policies. The feedback sessions had a couple additional ideas regarding implementation, things around fee collection frequency, which some preferring weekly and some preferring monthly. So looking at those ideas, flexibility on guidelines and platforms for collecting fees, as well as support for other methods like payment plans and other ways to accommodate families. So I think, as we expected, very much in the vein we expected to hear back, and really grappling with some of those tensions where you have a family fee at a part of the system that really is attempting to be trying to provide access during a very difficult time for families, low-income families. Just as a reminder, we will continue to pay for our fees through the end of this fiscal year, and this fee chart will be worked into our subsidy regulations, which are underway and plan to put forward to the board by the end of the fiscal year, as required by the budget legislation this year. So that is the end of my substantive updates. I wanted to highlight just and introduce a key new player to our EEC team, and so highlighting that in the momentum that the board offered in my review of really thinking about how we organize and staff up. One of the things that we have done at EEC is take the Deputy Commissioner of Field Operations that was over 7 or 8 different units and had iterated over the last few years, and have developed a Deputy Commissioner for centralized field operations that is over 3 critical functions for the department that really intersect with other agencies, other departments, and have a specialized function. And so I am thrilled to introduce Andrew Rome, and I'll let him introduce his background, but I'm thrilled to introduce Andrew Rome, who will be the Deputy Commissioner for this role over the background record check function, the investigations function for the department, and the licensing for residential and placement programs. And this is really I think represents a key onboarding of expertise that will help. His background from DCF will help us make sure that we are really a collaborative player around these 3 areas and looking at our function in relation to what the Commonwealth needs overall. And really excited his success in supporting a redesign of background record checks at DCF. Very excited to have him on, and also highlighting, while we'll be able to address some of the plans on background record check during this meeting, is because we now have a leadership who will be able to help us make sure that that's implemented. So Andrew, please, if you don't mind introducing yourself very quickly.
Not at all. Thank you, Commissioner. I really want to thank everybody. I'm so looking forward to continuing. It's been a month so far at EEC, and it's just a great organization, and the energy that's in this organization for change, I think, is the start of something great, and we'll be able to get there. Looking very much forward to not having complaints about BRC, and just providing that as a service, so that, I look at my position as, how do I support the programs? How do I support the field? And one of those is that BRC is responsive to the needs of all, and not just processing paperwork, but we really need to be responsive. We need to look at how are we doing things and what can change to improve our efficiency and our effectiveness as part of ensuring that children are safe. And that includes having staff available to be in programs. So they all work together. And I think that, with the leadership of the commissioner, we're going to get there. I already see the light at the end of the tunnel, which is tremendous. My background is, for 7 years, I represented parents and children in child welfare and did real estate. Realized that that's not where the love was, but that it was about parents, children, child welfare. So I decided I wanted to be a trial attorney, and that's what I was going to be at DCF, was a trial attorney. That lasted about 2 years when I became a manager, and took on more responsibility than what I thought earlier on I had wanted to do. And then about 7 years ago, I became general counsel for the Department of Children and Families. And as part of that, I ended up taking over the background record check unit. And we were able to go from, on a regular basis, of approximately 25,000 BRCs pending, to right before I left, I think the count was at the end of, as of a Friday at 5 o'clock, it was at 68. When it went over a couple of hundred, I get very nervous and was like, okay, folks, what are we doing? Why do we have this, et cetera? And, you know, because I just wanted it always under 100. And they were like, yeah, we know, Andrew. So we were able to make some real effective changes there. And it became, as when I left, I said, you know, when I started, the calls I got were complaining about BRC, how long it would take, the accuracy of the information. And by the time I left, the calls were how amazing the BRC folks were, and how their work really supported and helped the field and really helped do placements, especially, you know, when we wanted those placements with kinship. To me, coming to EEC just continues the work of families and children, hopefully more preventative than where I was before. And I strongly believe that with a strong early education, we can have children grow up to be completely and fully independent and meaningful people in our society. So, and I'm looking forward to that in my older age, that's who's going to take care of me. So I need that. So I'm really looking forward to it and hoping that we can accomplish some really good things together.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really fabulous to have you on board. Thank you so much for all that you've done for the field and now all that you will do. And particularly appreciate the service agency framing. I think that's been a big pivot in the last few years to really kind of move from some foundational building blocks and compliance to now kind of how do we really serve the field as an agency. So it's fabulous.
Yes.
Welcome.
As I said to some providers, it really needs to be how does EEC support the field and providers, not the other way around. That's
right. Yep, no question. And that's what agencies all over the country are grappling with, right? You've got administrative compliance work, but ultimately, that's not what changes the game.
Right. Exactly. Absolutely agree.
Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
So I'm obviously very excited, and I think excited to have someone who clearly knows a lot more about background record checks than I do, to be able to help figure out how to make that a well-oiled machine and build some efficiency so we can serve the field, but also our investigations and R&P and the real intricate link with DCF there to make sure that we are playing our role and really supporting DCF in the role that they need to play as well. So thank you so much for the extended intro time. I wanted to just highlight that that Andrew's onboarding as Deputy Commissioner is part of a revision of our organizational chart. And so you will see that in the upcoming month, which also will coincide with a move for EEC's Central Boston office. And so our next would be announcement going out, but our next meeting we will be safely landed May 1st. And for anyone listening and or any board members who want to come visit, we'll be at 50 Milk Street after that point. And so we'll want to make sure that all of that is part of our revision of our organizational structures as well. And with that, I will turn it over back to you, Teresa.
Thank you. Great. Thanks for all the updates. We're going to move now just to the routine business of approving the March 9th, 2021 meeting minutes. I have reviewed them. I did not see any need for changes or catch anything. Did others catch anything that need to be fixed? They are excellent. So I will make the motion to approve the minutes from March 9, 2021 Board of Early Education and Care meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
Great. And I'm just going to go on my screen. I'm going to start with Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Joni Block.
Yes.
Eleonora Viegas-Reimers.
Yes.
David Cruz.
Yes.
Joan Wasser-Gish.
Yes.
Allison Schoenwald.
Yes.
Secretary Pizer.
Yes.
Thank you. Approved. All right. We will launch into our items for discussion and action. We're going to start with the update, as the commissioner promised, kind of the engagement update. We'll start there.
Excellent, thank you. I am going to hand this over. I'm going to give a little context. I'm going to hand this over to Eli, who's been deeply engaged in bringing the information and supporting the department as a whole to make sure that we're actively engaging across initiatives for the department as we look at the strategic plan implementation. Today we'll talk about the engagement. We'll talk spend a little bit more time on the strategic plan implementation and some of the deep work around the importance of building a pipeline of educators while we invest in programs, as we've been discussing for the last month. And then we'll talk a little bit of updates on our grants and the federal funding that we know folks are waiting to hear more about as well. So just to start on the engagement update, to give a little bit of context before I hand it over to Eli to talk deeper. As you remember, in our strategic planning process, we had thousands of people engaged in the conversation, able to talk iteratively from their perspective, and really felt that there was a co-construction of the plan that we were able to pass with the board and looking forward. I think there was a deep commitment to being able to sustain that kind of rich engagement where we were ensuring that there were opportunities for a variety of voices and a variety of different ways to come to the table and be part of the process. I know some of you have been able to engage with us around some of the topical conversations and really eager to hear about your experiences there too. But I think that we've been able to, as we've been saying to you, able to really take a much deeper, robust approach to the feedback. And as Chair Lasso is saying, we are at this place where we are trying to really iterate quickly on systems building that have real life impacts across our community. And so being able to ask some critical questions as we are making these decisions has helped compensate for a couple of things. One, gaps in data we all have when we're trying to figure out how to make the best decision, to be able to color some of the hard and fast data limitations we have with the real life experiences on the ground, and have also been able to help us understand where people would prioritize different decision points as we head forward. So there has been some really deep conversations about specific initiatives, and Eli is going to go through and be able to update on what we're hearing. But I wanted to highlight what we're doing of really bringing that back in and actively engaging in that as we're looking at contracts, as we're looking at pivots, and as we're looking at priorities for systems building, to help make sure we're responsive to the field. We've been doing deep engagement since we launched this, as you know, in December. And right now for the month of April are taking a step back on the ongoing iterations of webinars and surveys to help provide some of this information back to the field. Starting with this meeting here, we'll do deeper dives in individualized groups around some of the specifics that in particular stuff that's in the appendix for the board, but we won't present on today. And as we look forward to that to be able to show how we are using this data before we go out and gather more in additional engagement in May. We know that this is a little bit of a different approach than the way that the department has done this in the past in terms of trying to bring broad voices and thousands of people who represent a variety of different stakeholders to help us resolve some of these real tensions in the field around the multiple players we support and the multiple stakeholders that we're responsible for ensuring have access. And so really excited about that. And because it's so new, really, and I think really fits this kind of time, weird time we're in COVID, of being able to try to engage massively in ways we can't do in person with small groups. We've really found strategies that will bring people in, but wanted to be able to show and really demonstrate how this is informing our work. So it doesn't just feel like constant iteration, but you actually see the ways we're trying to embody this as a data-driven decision making, and that these data points, which are some qualitative, some quantitative, but very robust responses from the field are part of that decision-making process. And with that, I will hand it over to Eli to talk around the data that we're hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, for that important framing on the purpose of this engagement and its trajectory. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you. We have on the next page can see just a snapshot of what we have, the engagement so far, the reach and the depth. We had over 7,000 responses across a couple of different methods of engagement. So we've held 21 live sessions where we're actively in conversation with a group of people in a Zoom room, and 8 surveys since December. All of these are conducted with a very transparent feedback process where people are able to see their comments in real time, to respond to additional questions, to go deeper on a specific topic, et cetera. And then in terms of accessibility, we've held every session both during the work day, during work hours, as well as in the evening to accommodate different schedules. And we've always offered an option for simultaneous Spanish interpretation so that we can engage across audiences and languages. We also have offered relevant topics for specific audiences. So with most of these, we've had a family childcare session, a center-based care session, as well as a school age only session, so that audiences are able to opt into the conversations that are most relevant to what is unique in their work. I'll also say that it's a full loop. So there are videos of sessions, a synthesis of key feedback. All of that is published on the Strategic Action Plan site. And while that has been going on from December to March, we've seen almost 13,000 visitors to that site, unique visitors, who have visited over 16,000 times and viewed pages 33,000 times. So we've seen a heavy level of traffic and engagement in all of these initiatives, whether it's absorbing information, providing feedback, et cetera. So if we look at the next page, we want to share just a couple of the themes that have come through most sort of loudly across each of our strategic plan pillars, the things that we're really doing in response to the feedback that we've heard. And I will say that this is just a snapshot. There's more detailed reporting out happening in the engagement portal. At the systems level, we asked primarily about licensing regulations and received widespread support for an approach that customizes the regulatory approach for the department across each program type. We have taken that to heart and are moving forward with an approach that then looks at licensing regulations uniquely for family childcare, for center-based care, for school age, et cetera. As with many of the areas and the ways that Commissioner referenced, we heard competing needs. And so we heard about a desire for flexibility, as well as a desire for regulations that can support consistent interpretation and application across the state. So balancing those two needs is something that we are also taking to heart in the regulatory process. So based on all of this feedback, the department has committed to a simple, customized approach that can also support the innovation that we think will be required as families and their employers move through the recovery period. Program sessions focused on quality, with overwhelming concentration in those sessions on adult-child interactions as the key differentiator for quality programming, as well as for child outcomes. So as part of this feedback, EEC is zeroing in on how adult-child interactions can serve as a leading indicator for programs that have committed to a quality improvement mindset. Program sessions also focused on financing and thinking about financing through a lens of stability in the field. And the guidance from participants in those sessions focused on how EEC should think about prospective components of a funding formula for the upcoming stabilization grants. Within these sessions, participants also zeroed in on pay for educators as the leading priority for how they would direct those prospective investments. As we think about the educators pillar with the strategic plan, we heard about the role that participants wish to see EEC play as we think about credentialing and supports for educators, and a really resounding focus on how experience can be viewed as a really important factor in building educator expertise. Finally, as we think through the family lens, sessions focused on subsidies, as well as on a larger system of family and community supports. These sessions yielded incredibly helpful feedback that will guide a review of the subsidy system, the regulations, as the commissioner just referenced earlier, and potential changes to consider there. We also heard loud and clear about the importance of affordability for families at all income levels as we think about the overall system of care. We did want to also, just to frame the rest of the conversation today, on the next page, think about across all of the engagements, how are participants thinking about educators and the workforce through each of these lenses? And so we want to highlight some of those themes that are really actively guiding the development of the approach to credentialing, as well as the system of supports the commissioner will outline in a moment. I already articulated the importance of adult-child interactions, which are largely driven by educators, as you can imagine, as well as the focus among programs on investing in educators. But there's also an overarching desire to make the field more attractive to prospective candidates and to retain the educators who are already here. That's something I think is familiar to all of you. We heard it through the strategic planning process as well. Even more urgency around this as we think about the last year. At the same time, feedback has surfaced that there is not really a shared definition or understanding of what it means to build expertise within the current workforce. And that this lack of shared understanding can actually limit the field's ability to define and support a professional trajectory, and relatedly, the ability to recruit talented individuals to join the field. Simultaneously, we know and have heard from a number of educators who have vast experience, sometimes decades of work with young children that might not always be reflected when we think about just credit-bearing coursework, degrees, et cetera. So this suggests that a balance of many pathways that can reflect growing expertise will be required, and the capability to reach a level of qualification needs to account for those pathways and ensure that those pathways are well understood and commonly shared by providers and educators alike. So I will turn to the commissioner to dive deeper into the implications of this feedback as we think about the department's approach to future educator supports, and happy to answer questions as they arise then.
I just want to highlight that what there in the appendix and the version that you all got, there is far more robust information, and wanted to be able to capture that, have you read that. I think Eli pulled out some of the themes that were relevant to some of the conversations we're trying to drive at today. So you had a little bit more context of how we were making some of those decisions. But we spent a lot of time with families, for example, the family time talking also about what and how do we tell that kids are on track along the way. What kind of tools could we use, which as I said, trying to think about the parent fee implementation. We pulled out some of those themes that were relevant for that this week, but that is not all. And these deep, robust conversations are offering an opportunity to really highlight the complexity of our field, the complexity of the resources families need, and the complexity of communities, and allowing us to really see the individualized configuration of resources that communities are relying on, and trying to figure out what the state's role is to help bridge across those, particularly EEC's role in trying to bridge across those. So I just wanted to highlight in there that this is not all of it, and there's far more information, and we'll continue to try to get that depth and in different forums. And if all of you have any thoughts or ideas of different forums to go deeper into specific areas of this, while we can give a more global highlight here. And there's some questions.
Other questions from folks? You can feel free to jump in or use the raise hand function and I will watch, but it's harder to see you raise your hand.
Both Jody and Eleonora have questions.
Oh, do they? Okay, go ahead. I don't see them. Sorry.
So this is Joni. I was fortunate enough to be part of some of these multiple engagements, and I think it's really commendable that the offerings were such so that people could engage at different times of day, different languages, different topics. And so I really appreciate the efforts from EEC on that. Particularly around the family piece, I kept on hearing the clarion call, and I know it's not the topic of today, but the clarion call, particularly this past year, of the social and emotional supports needed for children, for families, for educators, in terms of ongoing support, but also really to think about at the pre-service and in-service level. That seemed, that thread just cut across so many different topics, that I was impressed, surprised by the consistency of what people were saying.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Jody.
No.
I was going to say, I agree, and I was not at this session, but have get regular feedback of what's happening at the sessions and get to read the notes. And I think not only agree with that, but I think are very much taking to heart some of the challenges we have in front of us of meeting different kinds of mental health and social emotional needs in different ways. And so we have started to look at prioritizing activities with our mental health consultation. And even I think one of the challenges we have that I heard back as I looked at that session is making sure people had appropriate expectations for what mental health consultation is versus direct intervention. And one of the things I heard back in that as I read the notes, and I think it warrants us to additional inquiries with the field as we try to make decisions around investments that can help address these needs, is unpacking some of the multiple definitions we all have around mental health supports, so that we're really trying to tailor the kind of investments to the specific needs of in-service that look different than they did 2 years ago, and same for families, and the kind of referrals that children are going to need and family support. So very much well taken to heart. And I think just from what we're doing right now are looking at prioritizing activities for FY22 with our mental health consultants, that we'd be able to bring back some of that feedback into our immediate kind of thinking and engagement with our service providers, as well as try to identify those gaps where we might need to build new services over the course of the next year.
Thank you. And I appreciate that. And I hear the issue about mental health. I think, and I'll be very interested in hearing what Eleonora has to say. I think this also addresses the importance of recognizing the domain of social emotional development, so that it is understood and implemented before we have to get to the intervention piece of it. So yeah, thank you.
I fully support everything that Joni said, but I wanted to add one more piece for our thinking together in reference to what you have in the slide right now as existing pathways to increase the skills and knowledge of the workforce. I think I know that I have been pushing for more and more interactions between EEC and DESE. And today I'm going to say we still have to keep that, but I think that we also need to increase the interaction between EEC and the Department of Higher Education, because I think that it's going to be critical to develop a state-approved way of looking at competency-based programs that really allowed people who have been in the field for a long time and have developed skills through professional development, through training, through coaching, to get higher education credit for that work, so that then they eventually can get to a degree. Because I think if you're looking at what the slide has in terms of increasing wages, increasing income, making the profession more attractive, we really have to look at very creative ways of literally bringing value to what people in the field already have without having to repeat coursework just to get credit, at the same time that we still keep very clear track of how are we going to professionalize the field or strengthen the professionals who are already in the field. And I really, really encourage us to think about how do we work across the departments, not only with DESE, which has a big part in the teacher preparation side, but also with higher education, because they could help us think about how do we create competency-based programming, particularly for early childhood educators who are already in the field.
Yep. I think that is well taken, and really, I think, have started to look with EOE on areas where we might need to think about flexibility, or different ways of working. I know that Secretary Pizer and I had an opportunity separately, but both heard the same thing, around some competency-based approaches to education happening at the community colleges. And I think lessons learned there, and areas that we can extrapolate. I think that I think there are a couple specific areas that are going at. So my experience in Chicago when we were looking at expanding was we knew we needed a pipeline of educators, and started with higher ed, and found, I think, Eleonora, to your point, that opened up all these scholarships and had such a lack of pipeline or coherence across our higher ed options that we really needed a lot of coaching and counseling for people. There is a sort of a approach that our field doesn't necessarily abide to, that's like, okay, you go and you do it one after another, year after year. And I think what we see with our field is engagement as their time allows, to be able to make progress towards a degree or credential, and being able to bring coherence, so that if something shifts, we haven't lost the progress that they've made, or it isn't confusing what their next step is. I think is going to take key partnerships with higher ed, and I think a state that has this structure where you have EEC, DESE, and EOE and DHE under a secretariat offers such an opportunity for us to think about those aligned flexibilities, and be able to try to build some of those pathways. And so really excited about that. The other thing I will highlight, as we kind of in foreshadowing some of the next part of the conversation, to that point, Eleonora, is that in talking with our higher ed partners, just preliminarily trying to understand what some of the tension point successes where we can move forward. One of the things I think they've really tried to emphasize to us too is the need to think about credit bearing and not credit bearing coursework together as needed entry points and supports for the fluidity that's needed across those for all of our partners for our specific educational workforce. And I think when you think about the gap that I hear all the time between the practical experience and the expertise and knowledge, that's going to be a key bridging point to some of how we bring the expertise through credit-bearing coursework, but also really infuse that with a lot of practical experience that our providers are getting in real-time in-service supports on the ground.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
If I can just add on to that piece, that I think we look at the opportunity this presents to look at past experiences in the Commonwealth, is that we have so many institutions of higher ed who have been part of building the system of teacher prep and in service. And an example of that is exactly what you just talked about, Sam, those dual courses that address content and the academic support. And so many of our institutions of higher ed have that in place and can really help with our workforce and our educators. So I hope that we kind of bring that back and draw upon that.
Yep, absolutely. And I think playing to your point of playing EEC's, most effective role in bringing coherence without losing some of that really robust system that has been part of the growth thus far. Are there thoughts or comments? Well, thank you, Eli, for helping bring all of that to light. And I can't emphasize enough how amazingly I think both affirming of how people want to be engaged and being able to really emphasize that the things that we know and are investing in are things people are caring about and feel are the right the right kind of impactful investments. But I think that, to Joni's point, and Eleonora's point, and some of the feedback is the devil's in the details, and being able to understand some of the nuance on there in real time with thousands of people has been such an asset to the rapid urgency that we need to respond to the work right now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eli. It's really great. Should we turn now to educator initiatives, Commissioner?
Yes.
Great.
I want to set a little bit of context for this, of why we are spending time on this, and harkening back to the structure of our strategic plan that looked at educator competency as a program investment and financing question. We have right now, we spent last meeting talking a lot about the investments that we'd be making with the federal funds. We'll go over the total amount that we expect from Massachusetts over the course of the meeting, but we have over $700 million of federal funding that has been allocated to Massachusetts, obviously much more for the country. And thinking we have, I think, laid out some strategies that respond to our ability to invest in compensation at the program level. And I think very thoughtfully tried to make sure that we are providing operational flexibility in the dollars, in our plan for the dollars. Obviously, it's an initial plan, still getting much more detail, and looking to try to think about the initial steps versus the long-term strategy that might be worked on with the legislature and the administration, and thinking about what long-term goals we might have. Right now, we know that keeping staff in our programs at an adequate compensation is vital. It was before, and even now when we're seeing us lose staff so consistently. And so our program investment strategy really does try to respond to flexibility that people need to invest in operations, and really knowing that operational model is largely dependent on the salaries of the humans who are delivering the services. That said, as we think about that operational investment in our programs, and thinking about, obviously, while our subsidies will continue to flow, looking at our, to be accessible, looking at our subsidy enrollment, we're still seeing challenges with having enough kids enroll in our subsidy to make that a viable program financing model during this time. As we look at these investments in educator compensation as part of that operating model, one of the huge challenges we have is helping our programs consistently differentiate the expertise of the educator workforce in a way that can help drive differentiation in compensation. It's very difficult to say invest in expertise if we don't all have a common definition of expertise. You look at other kinds of fields, and there is, whether you're talking about nursing, where you have gradations of nurse degrees, whether you're talking about social work, where you have gradations of social work degrees, whether you're talking about teaching, where you have a teacher licensure and endorsements and structures. It's very difficult in our work, as we've been trying to grapple with these program investments, to be able to provide guidance or thoughts around differentiation and compensation without a differentiation in the expertise and work of the workforce. And so felt, obviously, we talked about a few meetings ago about, as we're making these investments, having to make some critical choices very quickly about where our funding or where our systems building has to prioritize in order to be able to accelerate the impact of that sustainability, that stabilization funding, in being able to build back stronger than we were before, and addressing some of the largest pain points that we had. And so as we've been looking at that, that's why we really wanted to focus on the educator work today, and looking at how we are really thinking about the system of building differentiation of our professional workforce here, that would help us be able to make sure that investment in our programs really can help build a system that will impactfully build a pipeline for the workforce, and make sure that that pipeline is sustainable, and to Eleonora's earlier point, that there are coherent supports around that pipeline in a way that helps make sure that we're sustaining the workforce and not seeing the churn that we traditionally have seen in this field. So that's really where we want to talk about today, and be able to look at some of those areas. We're going to start by talking about some of the pain points we heard during the strategic plan that we're looking to try to fix as we move forward, and then look at some of the fundamental infrastructure that we know we need to build, and then some of the aspirational frameworks that will help us make sure that we're again headed towards a vision of more comprehensive, more sustainable pipelines for the workforce moving forward. I want to say two things in this before we get into the details. One is that that obviously we know that there are some big challenges in the infrastructure and the coherence across some of EEC's functions. And so we do know there'll need to be investments in technology and operations and our own workforce to make sure that we can address these challenges. And so as you heard Andrew Rome start to talk about how we will make those investments simultaneously, but that we're not pulling back on some of the advances for the conceptual framework overall of where we're headed. We're not waiting till the operations are done so that we are building it in a way that can really build towards a better future. And quite frankly, address some of the areas where Massachusetts has an opportunity to advance the field as a whole. Massachusetts licensing standards are some of the most comprehensive, the most the highest quality in the country. And you heard me say last time or a couple times ago around our licensing standards rival most states' top level of the QRIS and the quality rating metrics. And so we start from a really robust place for our program standards. That said, the educator standards that we hold our educators to are not at that level. And so really understanding our opportunity to help build some framework across our educators, and not to say that our educators aren't experts, our educators aren't bringing a level of expertise to their profession, but that the framework that EEC has offered hasn't necessarily been able to validate that expertise in a way that really builds a workforce as opposed to just an individual's passion for learning and improving their practice. And so that's really where we're headed at today. And that we know that our programs to really operationalize a new structure and compensation modeling in their own programs and their own business will need some of guidance and framework to be able to help make sure that this is part of the operational reconfiguration that our programs will have to go through as we respond to new needs. So I'm not going to read through all of the barriers, but I wanted to highlight again the problems we're trying to solve. Oh, if you can go back one moment on that. I just highlight quickly the problems we're trying to solve and then the ways we're trying to solve them. So again, I think the challenge with not having an educator framework that helps make an equivalency across different people's judgment is that it really makes it so that the individual educator is grappling with each individual role as if it's a new opportunity, as opposed to building the expertise over time. As I spent a lot of time when we were allowed to do this, going and listening to different educators and programs and people talking about it here all the time. And many of you are examples of this, have told me of moving in and out of different types of roles in our system. So from a teacher to a family childcare provider, to a home visitor, a CFCE coordinator. Many of our agencies may be multi-service agency where you may play different roles that will engage with families versus have direct oversight for children. And so in that, each one of those, if we treat each one of those as an independent experience for our educators, we are not validating the increasing competency, the increasing expertise that they are building over time, and giving our providers, our directors, our employers, the ability to have a neutral lens to be able to say, this expertise has been validated by an entity that knows how to do this. And I'm not trying to piece together these things. There is a credential that has been awarded on that. And that has the ability to validate the expertise, to be able to make sure that those that expertise, that all employers are at least using a common lens. It may not be the only lens they are using. If you are serving a specific population, you may look for an expertise plus a specific experience. You may look, if you're looking to work with families in a specific way, there may be a robust experience that you're looking on the family side, or with a language, or a specific kind of access. But giving some common metric will help us make sure that there's a playing field that that our workforce can play on, that allows them to transfer across different employers, and still not treat every role as if it's a new qualification, but building qualifications. And that will allow us to understand our functions of EEC, not as I'm going for a teacher and then I need to have a different set of qualifications, but understanding the through line across all of our functions to make sure, again, we are building each individual's expertise into a common workforce approach to being able to build the pipeline. So looking at then, what does that mean for what we're trying to do here? One of the key, we can move to the next slide. One of the key barriers that we know is that all of our teacher qualifications right now are actually embedded in our program licensing standards and regulations. And so all of the expertise a teacher has right now is actually attached to their role in a licensed program. So for one of the things for us is to start to detangle that, to be able to say from a program standpoint, this is the roles you need to have, but also to build that common framework for educators that allows us to really see how they're developing over time and moving in and out of roles, and validating that competency and expertise, and not attaching that only to the qualification for the role they may have at a certain point in time. So this is a lot of where we're headed in this, of really thinking about building a structure for educators that is independent of licensing, that would help us make sure that we are looking at this as a workforce and not just a series of roles in our programs. Looking at our own functions, looking at the technology and supports we would need to build in order to make that coherent and efficient for them, and then also looking at how we would validate that through some sort of a credential and an endorsement of those experiences that would be transferable for a educator looking to move across a system, across geographies, or across a different across their own, getting more leadership experiences within their own program. So again, now I want to look at how we're actually going to look at that. So the first one is to really understand that this barrier is really about understanding how we need to separate our program standards and our educator standards in a way that really helps us look at our educators as independent of the role they may be in. Moving on to the next slide starts to look at what are the concrete building blocks of that. When we look at what we know is the first very fundamental function that EEC plays is being able to run background record checks for every individual who works in our licensed programs. That is a key function for us. You all helped approve the new background record check regulations over the last few months, and we're able to start that as a foundation. And really excited now that Andrew Rome is here to really dig deep into what we know needed to come next, which is around policies and operations. So we will begin that process in May, giving him a chance to step in, get oriented, and we'll start to dig deeper into where some of there are policy barriers. I think there was widespread agreement as we did public comment for our regulations that many of the challenges people were encountering were in policy and operations. And so now, having corrected a few of the big barriers in the regulations, ready to dig deep into the two areas that I think will inevitably need some detangling with some new ways of doing things. And so we are looking at our internal operations, understanding how we embed our background record check teams more with some of the parts of the organization, like licensing, that are interdependent with some of these, so we can solve people's challenges, we can gain some expertise. And that we look at when there is a decision in those operations. Right now, the decision's final, and we know that there's many gray areas as we try to take a more active anti-racism and equity lens to our work in EEC, that there are many areas that are gray areas that we want to allow for the voice of the individual to be part of our process. And so because of that, we're looking at trying to understand appeals and what appeals would look like, an appeals process, as well as what kind of documentation might provide a more equitable lens into a situation that could help us understand the impact on the individual, any rehabilitation that might have happened since an incident had occurred in an individual's background, and their current suitability for working with children. So I know we and probably you have heard many active pieces of feedback from the community about engaging in this, and that will be part of our engagement process in May, and we'll launch some of that to be able to address the protocols, the policies, and some of these really critical areas for improvement that we know will help us take a more active role in this area. I'm going to move on to a couple other things and pause at the end for questions, but I'm watching. If there are hands raised, then let me know and I'm happy to interrupt. The second, moving on to the next slide, the second key piece of infrastructure that we are going to build is the professional registry. This will be, right now at EEC, we have pieces of information housed in different databases, in different units, and the interconnection for an individual educator, as we've been hearing back, can be very confusing. What I need, where am I looking, how do I demonstrate a CEU, a PDP, a teacher qualification versus a professional qualification, where does the early ed essentials and the learning management system fit in, and how do those required, and really, as we think about trying to empower our educators to own their own professional trajectory more actively, and as we look at investing in resources for those educators and professionals, and wanting them to be able to have some tools to evaluate where they are and where they need to go next to be able to take advantage of those. Part of that is contingent on having a unique database of educators who can access their information in one place as opposed to across different units at EEC. So the key fundamental component of that is trying to develop one professional registry that will house all of this information that currently is in different databases. We started the process of being able to deduplicate at least who is currently working in our programs in our lead database over the last few months, and have a good foundation to be able to look at building this out, not to make the perfect the enemy of the good, but actually to start substantively making a difference in this. So we we can start to track, again, the investments that we're making in our programs, almost $1 billion over the next few years. We really want to make sure that those dollars are having an impact on our workforce. And in order for us to do that, we have to know the individuals in our workforce and what the impact is on them. So building some of this where you have these lists of information that would be housed, we're working on what that means for existing information that currently sits in a database that would need to be transferred and matched up with an individual, how that plays into requirements and a cohesive trajectory. But again, the first step being, the first step being how we can build an ease of access to the information in one place for our programs and start to build the infrastructure that they could be empowered to help bring their professional development into a demonstration of an increased competency, and quite frankly, be able to sell themselves to employers, and vice versa, have our employers be able to help see who is available, who's suitable to be in what roles, and who is qualified, and help be able to build that connection. So very excited that this is underway, and want to promise that this will be a very long process, but I think an important infrastructure to start as we start investing in programs, so we can start to get a lens, at least preliminary data that will help inform our investments over the next year. Moving on to the next slide, I want to spend the next time on the credential itself. I talked a little bit about some of those baseline things, those just operational infrastructure that we need to build to be able to start to make it a more cohesive experience for the workforce. But that's baseline, and what we're trying to build is a workforce that really has a cadre of educators who know where and how to build their expertise, validate that, and show that we're growing not just our programs, but the individuals our programs rely on to be able to deliver services. So we're going to talk a little bit about just, again, how this helps address this, but I want to spend most of the time talking through the key questions on the next slide around structures we're looking at. So again, what we're looking to do is build a framework, a credential that is very simple. We're not trying to overcomplicate, so it takes everything, but be able to solve some transferability and stackability of experiences across a system. So a job you have in Worcester would help translate if you had to move to Boston, et cetera. And same thing, that different roles where you may have some great experience to implementing individualized instruction in a classroom, and move to help do more of a family-oriented role, that is seen as stackable expertise that you're building, and not just a series of individual experiences. And that you're not having to sell yourself across those, that there's some validation that EEC is providing to help say, yes, here is the metric for a competency, and here is how we can show that you are doing that. There is an element. So I think one of the last point there is around thinking about all of the suites of services that you all were, I think Eleanor and Joy were highlighting as we were headed into this conversation, that contribute to that. So one of the things that this will try to do, and I think is an evidence from, for example, DESE's teacher licensure, K-12 teacher licensure, is that it helps coalesce across what some critical components of expertise are for the specific expertise of implementing services. So I think that, for example, a program of study in early childhood can prepare you to do many things, not just go and be an educator in a building. I mean, I certainly have an early childhood education. I am not a teacher. And so those kind of things are really important, and also setting that standard for EEC to say, if you're going to be an educator in our licensed programs, there's also some expectation of a specific expectation, a specific set of competencies within the general expertise you may have that we would expect you to demonstrate. In doing that and by setting that, we're able to pull not only around what early childhood knowledge is necessary, but also some of those practical experiences, those in-service experiences that we've invested so much in, build a common framework for all of those entities to use. So we really are all speaking the same language. We all are helping with the same trajectory for educators, that we're not, that as again, highlighting my Chicago experience, it's not on every individual to figure out, okay, if Eleonora said this and Joni said this, what's my next step? That we all are using the same ladder or lattice to be able to help people decide their next step. In this niche of early childhood, after school time, in this niche of the expertise, right? Again, being a professor, we would have a very different level of expertise that you would have to deliver than being a professional delivering services to children and families in the field. So that's really our goal here. I'm just going to go I'm just going to move on to the next slide, and then Joni open it up for questions completely. So just in 1 second on giving some of this. I want to just highlight that we're at the beginning of this. So there are some things we've heard back from the field and some national context that we know we want to account for. What we've heard back from the field loud and clear is that in Massachusetts, we have to be able to figure out how to validate experience and more formal professional development, credit bearing, coursework, et cetera. That we can't choose one or the other, and we have to figure out how to do both. So I think that's really important for us looking at the trajectory of and the equitable access to higher education in the past, as we look at the investments EEC and other systems have made in non-credit bearing, but still valuable types of training and coaching. And second, that when we look at the national context of making sure that we don't develop a system that is non-transferable as the country is all developing their system. And so there is a national framework through NACCE, through the National Association for the Education of Young Children, that has been developed called the Power to the Profession. So you see P2P there. This is at the very early stages from them. They have worked with national partners for a couple of years to develop this context, but haven't necessarily built out all of the guidance for states of what they would look at. We've been working closely with them to understand, and you have the framework here, but I feel very strongly that this is not just an adopting of a national framework to Massachusetts, given the context you have, and want to develop this in a way that could align for our workforce to be able to be transferable across states, but take into account the very specific Massachusetts context of how we would adapt it to be meaningful to where our workforce is and where our historical pathways have been. So we are not trying to just take NACCE and move it here, but really think critically about what kinds of pathways we need to build, but still be able to fit into the national landscape. So again, you have some of those key critical questions here. There's so much to grapple with, but that's where we're at with this. And I think as we think about these program investments, being able to accelerate this conversation so that we're able to offer over time a model for our programs to be able to consider compensation investments is really where we're headed, but making sure that we are validating also the vast expertise we have in the field and not setting a standard that is ignorant of historical context that doesn't really help us make sure that we keep, grow, and offer a pathway for people who are currently with us and not only think about the next generation that we want to grow. And with that, I really will open it up, and Joni, very happy to have your comment, but wanted to give the context of where we're hoping to go.
I'm glad you waited. Thank you, because I have a comment about this. This power to the profession is just, it's a fabulous concept. And I think if, again, if we build from what this says, building from a national perspective, the organizations that have been involved in building this critical and have a lot of traction in Massachusetts. For instance, at the community college level, the Access program piloted in Massachusetts the NAEYC credentialing for teacher prep programs at the associate level. And I think Deb Murphy is the president of Access. I'm not sure. She was the first person in Massachusetts to get her community college credential, which is great. So I think that that's a great template to look at, as you say, not to replicate, but to use. I also was really happy when you talked about the separation of the educator from the licensing program, and the recognition that we have a number of professionals, educators, who work in our early childhood field who aren't licensed people, nor do they work in licensed programs. And I think that that might be like tier 2 of where we go in terms of that. But how do we think of the trajectory for a home visitor?
Yep.
Who isn't licensed, who isn't part of our subsidy system right now, but certainly adds value to it. So I'm just thinking, what do we need to keep in mind as we move forward?
Yep. And I think about that. I look at other fields on some of that and think about, or other industries, and think about the applicability of teacher licensure or my social work degree in places that don't require a social work degree. So as the licensing entity, we can embed requirements in our licensing, and we do. And I think they're just, there's a lot of confusion around some of them and where we need to go. So we definitely have that lever that we pull. But I think, Joni, to your point, one of the things that we hope that this helps emphasize is how that lever actually can be used in other early childhood serving services to help understand a validated competency as well. So there is, I think I agree with you, we have a lot of room to think about a home visitor. Home visitors are across so many different kinds of programs that would definitely be a tier 2 question. But we hope even initially by saying, for example, if there is a, I'm going to change the terminology, EEC one, and really think about that validation, even though it's not required as a home visitor, demonstrates to that employer that I have a competency that EEC has validated, regardless of if you require it or not. And I think that's a hope that would help be transformational for the workforce, help be transferable, and then help us set up for maybe a tier 2, 3 down the road, thinking of alignment across some of those places we don't have direct oversight for, but certainly are intersecting with the programs we do have direct legal responsibility for, and really think about this as pushing a much broader vision for what the workforce can be across all of those services.
Fabulous. Great.
Go ahead, Joan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Commissioner, everything you've said is right. And also, given the fact that this is an area that EEC has focused on for a long time, a lot of what you shared resonates as familiar, which in some ways is terrific, because I think it means we have a lot of consensus in terms of concepts and sort of core agreements for moving forward. At the same time, this is an area where we haven't made as much rapid progress as I think the field needs and deserves, which I know you feel acutely. And so one of the things that really strikes me is, as you begin to kind of move from something like NAEYC's power to the profession and think about adapting something that already exists, I think that that's a real strength. I think one of the kind of places that we've struggled is in the sense of like constantly reinventing, as opposed to looking at what exists both within Massachusetts and beyond. And so I'm wondering, where else do we have strengths in terms of capacity, delivery, information, frameworks that we can build from and move much more rapidly to something that is really functional and not and really sort of helping us get to the next place in this work.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the CDA plus the work, the career pathways, the work with the community colleges, I mean, as you all pointed out, earlier, the real robust higher education institutions here are real opportunities for us. And I think there's been a lot of thinking about that transferability of credit bearing and non-credit bearing, and I think that's a huge asset here. I think as you see some of this, but some of the questions embedded on the page, but what we've heard back, as I alluded to robustly throughout this process, is really the balance of the variety of different in-service, pre-service, credit-bearing, non-credit bearing opportunities and how we validate those. I will say, I think there are and try to figure out exactly how to say this, that there are a number of ways that the community as a whole have stepped up and filled some gaps that because we haven't had some cohesion across the requirements from EEC. And I think as we as a team learn about those on a regular basis, and people will come after hearing meetings like this or hear us start to talk about this and say, oh, I've been doing this piece, I've been doing this piece. It is a huge asset that building from. And I think that one of the things that's incredibly valuable here is to be able to bring some of those together, bring a common framework so that everyone, and they've been asking for this, everyone can make sure we are using the same. Everyone wants to be helpful. No one, if they're off message, they don't, it's not intentional. It's, providing the common framework so that that asset can really be leveraged, not only to be able to kind of fill gaps, but actually build to a much larger vision for those educators than just sort of spiraling through, requirements, but making sure those requirements build to the larger whole. So, I mean, I think it feels when we talk about this in this forum and others that we're still at somewhat of a conceptual phase, but to your point, Joan, I think is really, really quickly emerging as the path forward. Is there's so many concrete building blocks. It's really about bridging the conceptual and the real concrete existing opportunities, existing assets, much more so about that than it is about recreating or having to do anything new, and finding out what's working across those towards this vision and expanding, because we know that we don't have enough now. Otherwise, we'd have a workforce that was in abundance, and we don't have that. So, trying to figure out some of a common metric by which to measure those, so that we can then invest in that's working and help those that aren't, to be able to understand why and what needs to be done.
Commissioner, just one last question, which we can talk more about another time, but just to flag, does the NACCE framework address some of these key questions? In other words, it's one thing to put a framework out there, but your key questions are really the design challenge, right? That we all ought to take up across the field nationally. Does NACCE's framework deal with these at all?
They're working on that. And I think this is where we're on a sort of learn and together process. Our urgency is not going to allow us to be able to wait to be able to come up with some of this until they have that figured out. That said,
well, maybe we could help. I mean, right? So yeah, okay, that's helpful. I just was curious, but happy to, this seems like one of these things where we could do some brainstorming with a whiteboard around a table and play around with some ideas. But the key questions to my mind are everything. Like, it's great to have NACCE's three pieces of the puzzle and the ladder, or whatever you want to call it. But really, your key questions are the evergreen challenge in this field as we think about next steps. So it's great.
Yeah. And I think that's where we're getting deep. And I think, what we want to do is be able to communicate to people more than just early childhood that this profession has value. We want to be able to communicate beyond ourselves. And so the simplicity of the NACCE framework is very helpful with that. But to your point, if we have the simplicity without the real context of the Massachusetts workforce, we will just shoot ourselves in the foot. And I think it's that balance, which I agree is the hard work ahead, which we will have to deeply engage in to be effective.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I read NACCE's framework as how you might think about it when people are entering the field. That doesn't help with today's field. Great. And I just want to say publicly, like, I'm really glad you're thinking hard about the optics and the lived experience for those who are today on the ground, particularly in 2020 and 2021, who need a strong signal about their commitment and expertise. And so however we can be helpful, I think this is a place where maybe Massachusetts could be very helpful as NACCE continues with this work.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. And I want to reiterate that this is, because I know there's fear in the field around this. There is no intention of this to try to set a line that wouldn't respect the vast amount of expertise that our program professionals are bringing in with them at this point. So this is about validation and growth and not about elimination in any way. And so I just want to keep reiterating that, because that is the challenge of adapting a framework from a national context to the 5,000 plus family child care providers we have here, and the 1,200 child care centers that are grappling with just getting any staff in to be able to operate right now. That we are not trying to jeopardize the functions and operations. We're really trying to think about the forethought and the growth that we'll need if we're going to take this opportunity ahead of us and really leverage it to a bigger whole.
Great.
So thank you for pointing that out.
Appreciate that.
Excellent.
All right.
So so moving on to the budget updates, there's a couple things that we wanted to highlight here. First is just updates on where we are on the grants we mentioned last time. You have the workforce and the FCC facilities grants here. These are ones that we have, these are funds that we have appropriated to us already in the FY21 budget. And so we are able to move forward on that. We're working diligently to create a new grant process. I know it feels to all of us, including me, like it's taking a long time, but in government world, getting a new grant process up for $25 million this quickly is not actually incredibly long. So we have progress, we continue to build those systems, and we do hope to have the application out quickly. I do want to highlight two things on this. One, that we are working within the parameters of the FY21 budget legislation. And so that money particularly for our center-based programs, we are limited by that legislation to provide it to only subsidized programs. And that is not a choice that EEC is making. That is a limitation of the legislation. So I know that we've gotten a lot of feedback from that. You all have gotten a lot of feedback from that. And I wanted to just make it clear that is a limitation that we have. The second thing that I want to make clear is that this is for the state funding that we already have appropriated. The federal funding that we have on the next page, if you go to the next the next slide, this is the federal funding. All of this is currently waiting for appropriation to EEC. And so I know there's a lot of questions on our timing to distribute this funding, and we won't be able to distribute this funding until we have a budget process to do so and have a budget appropriation to do so. And so I just want to highlight that. I'll talk a little bit about what we're preparing to do on this so that when we do have an appropriation, EEC is able to move as quickly as possible. But I wanted to answer, I know that the perpetual question that we're all getting, which is when will the federal money be allocated or be dispersed into the field? And the answer to that is we're preparing for when we have a budget appropriation to be able to do so. So what you have here, let me just describe this slide. It was a little hard. We used a national slide that looked over the federal funding and tried to add the Massachusetts context to this. So what you have here is the federal amounts, the national amounts that have gone, that have been appropriated by the federal government at this point. We don't have award letters from the ARPA funds, that the last stimulus dollars that passed. And so so you see at the top, all of our, we've estimated, but we could be wrong about that. I know that in the past there was questions just around the timing of the fund. So I thought this slide was a really helpful way to see exactly when the money had to be spent, and given the different buckets we have, exactly how those played out for us. So again, you have the urgency of us getting these are all federal fiscal years, just to say, so that is November through October, in terms of what that looks like. So again, the CARES Act obviously went out as reopening grants last year, and so that has been spent, but the CRSA dollars and the ARPA dollars from the 2021 and 2022 buckets, the 2021 allocations, are what we are discussing, the funding formula, the C3, the Commonwealth Cares for Children formula, that we've been working very closely with the community and getting feedback on the data, and hope to have an update for you at the next meeting. That formula could be used across these funding streams to deliver operational dollars with a lot of flexibility to our programs. And so that is what we're looking at. Again, given the fact that we have a 3-year obligation period for some of this funding, it allows us to test and see and make adjustments along the way if there are better ways to be able to distribute. But right now, prioritizing operational dollars based on criteria we discussed at the last meeting, with lots of flexibility for programs to be able to stabilize and sustain their operations through the recovery period, given fluctuations in enrollment. So I knew there were a lot of questions on this, so I just wanted to make sure it was in one place and everyone were able to see some of the details on it, and happy to answer questions as we go forward. But the last thing I wanted to address on the budget fiscal component is just around our caseload. You have a lot of detail on our caseload. So I wanted to, if we go to the next slide, just have a bullet points of what we think would be relevant for you to see in all of the data on the caseload that you have over both in the appendix and in the PowerPoint. And so really continuing to analyze our caseload numbers and the budget spending. So as you remember, because we've been doing so much more full day supports than we had, we've not only been looking at what our numbers are, but what those expenditure differentials are. And we still see that we have increasing costs, even though our enrollment is not increasing as rapidly. And so just continuing to pay attention to that, you still see that in some of the bullet points through the appendix. Wanted to also highlight that we were able to make some adjustments to our contracted providers, where we were able to alleviate some of the restrictions they were that we had to put on them around flex pool, which is some of the flexibility they have on capacity caps to their enrollment. Given those often happen in a contract by age group or classroom type or program type, and seeing as our age groups were just all over in terms of who was needing care, we were able to alleviate that and monitor on an every other week basis to make sure we were not overexpending, but allowing them to have the flexibility across their age groups to be able to enroll in what they needed. So we are seeing that is impacting some enrollment, and we are seeing some income eligible increases, which I think is a great thing for some of our providers. We aren't seeing that consistently. Some of our providers still are decreasing enrollment despite this flex cap increase. So we're really carefully watching all of that and being able to see any trends there. The wait list is also a continued question. So while we are still for February down about 500 providers, just under 500 providers. I'm sorry, just under 500 children in our enrollment overall. We still do see the wait list hovering around just over 11,000. I wanted to highlight that happens, that wait list accounts for those that are signed up on a wait list for a specific provider, a contracted provider, and those that are signed up on a wait list through the Child Care Resource and Referral Agency. So the ones that are signed up for the specific provider, that contracted provider is in communication with them, and we're working, knowing that our contracted providers have some barriers, bureaucratic barriers and systems barriers just to enroll them. We are working to try to alleviate some of those. But the bigger question to us is what's happening with those that are on a general wait list and need outreach and support getting into programs. So we have been working with our Child Care Resource and Referral Agencies to enhance their outreach to those families on the wait list, and been tracking their those numbers on a regular basis and seeing that about 2,000 funding letters. Those are letters to those on the wait list, letting them know they are now eligible for tuition funding based on their number on the wait list and their region. And those have been sent out in the past month, and have put in new systems with our Child Care Resource and Referral Agencies to be tracking this on a regular basis and understanding the effort and energy they're putting into this, knowing that our decreased slots are really, our decreased enrollment is really an opportunity to make sure we are offering as many slots, as many of those on the wait list as possible to be able to access care during this time. So with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions on the fiscal financing front, but I know there's a lot of information, so I just wanted to make sure that we were highlighting some of the key components that we're watching regularly, in addition to obviously caseload numbers and expenditures.
Thank you. Questions for the commissioner?
Nikki?
I have a question. This is Nikki. Is there a way for us to know how long families on average are waiting on the wait list through the CCRNRs?
Not super easily, but that's exactly what we're looking into, Nikki. We have meetings with the Kinderwait, who has the waitlist technology, to try to figure out if there are other ways we can be calling, other areas we can try to grapple with there. So I think in the next month or so, we have been able to pull different information from the waitlist and have some data analysts on our side dig a little bit deeper into it. So hope to continue to elucidate a little bit more of that information over the next month and be able to address some of it. Particularly, I think, Nikki, that part of the emphasis on that is we were seeing decreasing enrollment, but not as much employment. So the demand wasn't necessarily there. I think as we get back to more increasing demand, want to make sure that we're addressing those as quickly as possible so that we're setting everyone up for success over the summer. So that's part of the emphasis right now.
Great. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have two interrelated questions.
Yeah.
Have you been able to continue to track trends relative to program closures and openings? And what is that looking like? And what are we hearing in terms of trends as it relates to schools opening? And what sort of do we have any early indications about impacts on enrollment and thus program openings and closings?
Yeah. So we have been tracking program opening and closing and haven't seen significant shifts in the last couple, since February, so the last couple of months. And so one of the reasons to not keep reporting that, but we'll definitely give updates as now that we see school opening, some of that information will catch up this month. In terms of the school opening, so because for most school districts mostly started implementing that the in-person returned to full in-person learning just a week ago, and so don't have more early indications and anecdotal evidence than we do on any specific data at this point. But anecdotally, what we're hearing is two things. One, that families that there's concern around that full day reimbursement for our subsidies as families go back to in-person learning. And so this is the flexibility we're trying to continue to build in to say that we can continue to provide full day reimbursement through the rest of the year, knowing that if providers cut back on that full day and a family needs it, it will be very difficult to provide. So we're hearing that will help, again, anecdotally at this point. I need to see how many families actually this applies to when we move into this, but that will help providers be able to sustain themselves through the end of the school year, despite return to in-person learning. That is a portion of the population, of the school age population. We are also hearing anecdotally that parents are opting out of care altogether for the rest of the year if they're going back to in-person, so as to mitigate risk. And those are things we're trying to do to be able to, again, allow families to continue enrolling, even if they're not attending, to be able to save their slot, save the program, when knowing that they may only be in in-person learning for a couple months before we head into summer, and wanting to make sure that those services are available for them during the summer, and they're not having to choose between putting their children in more group care settings over the course of the year and having full day services over the summer. And so, again, that's anecdotal at this point, and we don't have it because our caseload accounts really are a month in arrears when all of that happens. We don't necessarily have March numbers to be able to calibrate that against, but we're carefully listening and watching, because we recognize that the way our current subsidy financing is set up, there's a tension between the health and safety decisions that parents are having to make and the fiscal sustainability of particularly those programs serving the most vulnerable kids right now. And so, yeah, that's about the best I can say about that right now. And not perfect, but paying attention to it.
Anyone else with questions? So what's just to go back to that, you don't need to show the slide, but I have one question, Commissioner, which is, when you took that national slide and kind of made it into a Massachusetts, what's your next milestone, like the most immediate milestone coming?
Yeah, so we've gotten the CURSA award, and we're waiting for the ARPA award letter to finalize those amounts from the ARPA. Those are estimated based on historical allocations and what we anticipate the percentage that Massachusetts would get. We've heard from our federal officer that we should expect an award in the next few weeks, so quickly. But again, the big milestone for us is having a budget appropriation that would allow us to start dispersing funds. And from the state. So the federal gives it to the state, and then the state has to appropriate.
So where are we at? So what's that time frame?
I'm going to hand that over to the secretary to answer, because I'm not totally up to date on that.
Okay, all right.
So it's a work in progress and kind of a negotiation around the timing of the release and consideration of the supplemental budget. It's I mean, this year is different than most years because the FY21 budget was enacted so late in the year that the subs are coming a little later than normally would be the case. The other question I have, and Commissioner, you may know the answer to this, or this may still be, an area of, trying to fully unpack what the feds have done with respect to ARPA is the ARPA tranche of funding for early ed. Does that have the same requirement of appropriation through state agencies, or is there some funds there that may be flexible that perhaps we could even accelerate ahead of the CRISA dollars?
Yeah, the CCDBG dollars do have the same requirements. I think we are looking into the stabilization dollars because that is a completely new bucket that has never been created before.
Yep.
We're looking into the rules around that. And I think there may be some way that we could accelerate distribution of those dollars ahead of the CRSA dollars. I think that's a possibility.
So it could be that if we get into a crunch here, that we might actually be able to use some of the newer federal money even before the older federal money is available to us. I mean, obviously, ideally, we'd like to just be able to plow ahead, under our own control, but it's possible there's some flexibility in the most recent federal tranche of funds.
So my understanding though, that the issue is just in terms of, say, work with ANF, or what level are we talking about?
The stabilization dollars in particular, there's a question of whether there's an emergency process that would allow, because it's an emergency stabilization fund, that would allow us to think outside of what the state appropriation process would be, as the secretary said. I don't have any information on exactly how that would work, or what additional restrictions that would put on it, or additional complications that may provide, but that is one area. I mean, obviously, as the secretary said, I think it would be with the appropriate, that would be using funds that were appropriated later by the federal government earlier, and still leave the big buckets of funds that would need appropriation as well.
So, like, are we talking about the May meeting, the June meeting, or what? Do you have a sense of the time frame, big picture?
I mean, this is above my pay grade because it involves not only sort of the folks in the administration at ANF, but also the conversations going on with Ways and Means and the legislature, and the FY22 budget is the House version of it is going to be released. So the Ways and Means Committee version of it is going to be released tomorrow, I think. Right, so that's all happening kind of at the same time. So again, it's an unusual process. So hopefully we can kind of walk and chew gum at the same time, but it kind of remains to be seen.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
I think for us, like the question of the formula itself, regardless of the funding, the formula would apply to all of these funding. So we have the flexibility for whatever one we are able to spend to use this mechanism to get it out, at least initially, regardless of which source it comes from.
All right, thank you. Joan, sorry.
One of the things I'm wondering, aside from timing and awaiting guidance about parameters in terms of how it can be expended, is if there is added flexibility, is there opportunity to think more innovatively about how to use particularly some of the ARP stabilization funds in the context of developing a formula for funding programs? So for example, I know in the slide deck that was sent, but maybe not shared, there was some initial conversation about kind of components and considerations relative to the formula. And, some of them have to do with license capacity. Some of them have to do with thinking about the population served. Some of them have to do with thinking about educators and support for educators. One of the dicier areas is around having a really good way to identify relative need amongst kids and families who are served within a given program. I wonder if borrowing from some of the ARP parameters as they relate to the child care tax credit and other places might be a way for us to begin thinking about how to effectively extend support to reach across the income scale to a wider array of families, but doing it through that program funding mechanism. I just want to put that out there as one place for innovative thinking with some of the federal dollars coming in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is where, as we were talking about last time, and Joan did get a lot of great feedback back on our formula, as is available on the slides. Didn't spend too much time in it for time-wise today, where we are. We really are trying to understand what that would do in terms of accessibility for families. And one of the things didn't talk about today, but I think completely agree that this is an opportunity to look at that, and coupling our work with the funding formula with some look at what the business community is doing over time that will affect parent choices, how the pandemic has impacted how parents are making choices on childcare, and doing some of that surveying analysis with both the region, knowing the region is going to be impacted this, and also some partners who understand business far deeper to be able to bring some of that to bear on as we try to provide accessibility in the market, not only how that might extend accessibility across the income spectrum, but also what kinds of innovation we may need to see from our programs or incentivize for programs in order to meet a very different need from parents than they had prior to the pandemic.
Mhm.
I think this will be a really interesting work for us we've been engaging and been able to work with philanthropy and the region to try to engage Bipartisan Policy Center, some national resources that look across childcare and industry and really think through in real ways. The Bipartisan Policy Center will look at family demand across the region, the New England region, and look at childcare access deserts pre and where the demand indications are to be able to say exactly what you're saying, Joan, like who and where should we be targeting for access as we look at innovative financing strategies.
Yeah, and there has been, we should end, but there has been a lot of mobility during the pandemic too, right? So some of the data coming out suggests a lot of movement, which plays into this strategy where there's some collaboration and a good look at the data. It's great.
Yeah.
It's really, yeah.
Here we are. That was jam-packed. There's lots happening. I will end how I began, which is to say, just appreciate the vigilance around the pandemic and the commitment to public health practices and supporting educators in their work through the pandemic while really pushing forward on this strategic systems building work. So thank you very much. You and your team, a warm welcome to Andrew as well.
Thank you all for all the support and collaboration and thought partnership on all of this, and very excited about the continued work on all that lies ahead.
Great. We'll see you in May. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you.
Bye.